तरफ बढ़ेंगे। और जैसा कि आप लोग को मालूम है, आज के हमारे बुक डिस्कशन के लिए हमने प्रोफेसर इरफान अहमद की मशहूर किताब रिलीजन एज क्रिटिक, इस्लामिक क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग फ्रॉम मक्का टू द मार्केट प्लेस, इसका हमने इंतखाब किया है। और इस इंतखाब की वजह यह है कि किताब बहुत ही फिक्रंगेज और मानाखेज मालूम अंगेज किताब है, जो बहुत ही क्रिटिकल इश्यूज को, बहुत ही अहम इश्यूज को जो है वो डील करती है, उससे वो हमको जो है वो वाबस्ता करती है, उससे जोड़ती, इंगेज कराती है। चाहे वो रिलीजन का मसला हो, एकेडमी में, फिलोसफी में, एंथ्रोपोलॉजी में रिलीजन को किस तरीके से देखा गया और पर्टिकुलरली इस्लाम के हवाले से क्या परसेप्शन रहा या उसको किस तरीके से उसमें लोकेट किया गया, और उसके बाद फिर क्रिटिक का पूरा क्या कंसेप्ट है, क्या यूनियोलॉजी है, और उसको किस तरीके से उस पर एक पूरा जो है वो कह सकते हैं गेम चला। तो इस हवाले से एक बहुत ही गैर मामूली काम आपने पेश किया है, और इसमें सीखने का भी बहुत कुछ है। और चूंकि एक क्रिटिक से मुताल्लिक किताब है, जिसके साथ क्रिटिकल इंगेजमेंट भी वो हम सबके लिए जरूरी है। तो सबसे पहले हम दावत देंगे बिरादर वसीम को। वसीम नासिर, आप हमारे लिए मुताज तारुफ नहीं है। आपका नाम वसीम नासिर है और आप केरला के रहने वाले हैं, और आपने IIUM मलेशिया से इकोनॉमिक्स में मास्टर किया है, और अभी आप मैक्स प्लैंक इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ सोशल एंथ्रोपोलॉजी जर्मनी से PhD कर रहे हैं। और आपके कई एकेडमिक रिव्यूज एंड आर्टिकल्स जो है वो इंटरनेशनल अच्छे जर्नल्स में पब्लिश हो चुके हैं। So we'd like to invite Brother Wasim to start with the commented discussion on the book.
Assalamu alaikum, and I'd like to begin by thanking SIO for organizing this wonderful event, and perhaps not thank them for putting me in this spot. It's a bit intimidating to be placed among such senior, accomplished scholars in the panel and then asking me to begin. But all jokes aside, I would like to begin by stating again that I consider myself a student in this field. And as such, what I intend to do here is to perhaps introduce the book to the audience who perhaps might not have read the book, and also give my humble opinions as I go on with the review. Now, as you are all aware, the book that we are reviewing is Religion as Critique, Islamic Critical Thinking from Makkah to the Marketplace. That was released in 2017, written by our esteemed Irfan Ahmad. And I see this book as in many ways a continuation of his earlier book, Islamism and Democracy in India, that was released in 2009. One could say that this book is in many ways a theoretical elaboration of the earlier work, and a strong intervention by Irfan Ahmad, particularly in the field of anthropology and Islamic studies. And just to quickly situate the book in the wider English academia, one could say that this book follows in the line of a very important and highly flourishing field, that is anthropology of Islam, particularly in the works of Talal Asad, who has done extensive work on modern secularism and liberal thought, particularly from an anthropological standpoint. And he has extensively looked at Islam vis-a-vis these dialogues. And in that sense, this book is a contribution in that line by particularly looking at South Asia, India in particular, and a focus on Jamaat Islami in India. Now, the book is presented to us as consisting of two parts. The first part is called as the Formulations, and then comes illustrations. The first part is very much theoretical and sets the stage from where the author goes on to give an ethnographic overview in his second part, that is the illustrations. Now, chapter 1 of Formulations, the first part, is very much a broad overview of Islam in contemporary world. Particularly, it's often connected to terrorism, irrationality, so on and so forth, particularly in global media. And then the author, Irfan Saab, goes on to look at the specific context of Islam in India and the particular case of Muslims being a minority in today's India. And as an illustration, he looks at the work of Amartya Sen and his book, The Argumentative Indian, wherein he shows that despite the ostensibly secular and liberal outlook that Amartya Sen tries to portray in the book, Muslims end up being somewhat alien to the largely majoritarian Hindu tradition that is indigenous, supposedly indigenous to India. He then moves on to chapter 2, that is very much theoretical intervention. He looks at the Enlightenment and argues that Western Enlightenment was an ethnic project of European West. I stress that again, he claims it to be an ethnic project. And what he claims to do in the chapter is an anthropology of philosophy rather than just philosophizing. And he claims to go about of this anthropology of philosophy by giving us a genealogy of how critique became conceptualized in a localized context, wherein reason became an abstract universalizing concept, which Irfan Saab argues has led to today's tyranny of reason and a myth that reason is all-encompassing. This is particularly through a reading of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, particularly his lesson on works of anthropology and geography. Now, Irfan Saab gives this highly elaborate intervention into European thought as a pretext of introducing Islam as an alternative mode of critique. And he claims that Islam, as this particular mode of critique, has a long history in a prophetic tradition where critique is very immanent. And this immanency, he claims, it's always connected to a particular ethos or tradition. And as a particular case, he brings up the concept of tanqeed in South Asian Muslim literature, where he shows that this particular notion of tanqeed was always intertwined with life, and reason was never autonomous, but something that presupposed a tradition or history. And as an example, he says that reason was always conceptualized as a combination of dil and dimagh in South Asian literature. Now, I think it's important to stress here that Irfan Saab is not just introducing a new concept, but he's also bringing this idea of tanqeed as a method for his anthropology. And he says it's not just simply to give an alternative to Western modernity, but also a method to question why critique is made, who and for what purpose such critiques are made for, and the conditions that facilitate such critique. Now, this sets the stage for him to move on to the next chapter that looks at a historiography of tanqeed in South Asia, wherein he looks extensively at what he calls secular literary critiques. And he questions a prevalent attitude among them of always pointing the origins of such critique in Greek thought. And one manifestation of this was their reading of Ghalib as being a critique par excellence, despite his Muslim stature. And Irfan Saab forcefully argues that Ghalib was a critique par excellence precisely for being within the tradition of tanqeed and being a Muslim. Now, this sets the stage for him to bring in Maududi, Sayyid Abdullah Maududi, and his particular ideas of Islah, as that will be elaborated ethnographically in the second part, which he calls Illustrations. Now, from here, we find Irfan Saab in a completely different territory, which many of us are familiar with. That is a highly interventionist ethnography, a lot of conversations, a lot of interactions. And this is set up mostly in northern India, and particularly in among Jamaat members, critics, sympathizers, as well as university campuses. The first chapter in this second part is called The Message, where Irfan Saab begins the chapter by looking at Maududi Saab's writings, particularly his critique of Western capitalism, as well as his take on Muslims being minority in Hindustan and subsequent India. And he also teases out some of the underlying conceptual take that Maududi Saab had in these takes, particularly by looking at his ideas on taqleed, its relation to ittiba, his ideas on ijtihad and tajdeed, as well as showing us a particular mode of thinking wherein there's this distinction between the lahir and the batin, where the former one is intervened mainly through fiqh, while the latter one is dealt with through tasawwuf or ishq, and so on and so forth. Perhaps as a comment here, while reading this chapter, as someone familiar with Maududi's works, there was an overriding sense that some of his more scholarly works were not attended to in this chapter. And as a result, one felt that one could not get how the scholarly community or the ulamas were attracted to Maududi's ideas, particularly his works like Tafhim or Char Bunyadi Istilah, which were much more popular among the ulama, were perhaps not dealt with in this chapter. Rather, his more interventionist works, or sometimes even speeches that later became books, were dealt with in this, which illustrated how an educated or an English educated middle class were attracted to Maududi's ideas, but perhaps the ulamas were connected to Maududi on another angle that might not have been dealt with in this chapter. Then comes the next chapter, chapter number 5, which is termed as State. And in this chapter, Irfan Saab looks at some of the critics of Maududi Saab, in particular Manzoor Nomani, Wahiduddin Khan, and Abul Hasan Ali Nadwi, as well as some sympathizers. And what Irfan Saab attempts to do in this is to bring to the fore an ethnography of everyday critique. Now, this is a highly original chapter, and one gets a palpable sense of how this everyday critique occurs. But an interesting dimension that could have added to this chapter was to explore how such forms of critique are connected or related to action. Now, one could argue that these everyday critiques are of particular form of action, but one could have substantiated that argument by looking at how such critiques stimulate particular actions or even induce inaction. Now, there are criticisms of Jamaat Islami and Maududi for bringing out particular political acts or even sometimes bringing up inaction in its members. Now, this could have substantiated the chapter in some sense, but as a whole, one could argue that this everyday critique was very well illustrated in this chapter. Then comes chapter number 6, which is termed as Difference, which looks at Maududi Saab's gender ideology. and which Irfan Saab, perhaps not to my liking, terms as Janus-faced. Just as a comment here, because Irfan Saab had earlier said that a good translation is one that betrays the destination language. And I wondered if perhaps a more indigenous phrasing could have better captured that. But that's just a personal thing. Now, Irfan Saab brings to the fore a lot of criticisms of Maududi on his gender ideologies, particularly in the Indian context. And he does this through illustrating a lot of alternative hermeneutics, how texts were read differently, how approaches were taken in a different sense than that which Maududi Saab adopted. But curiously, in this chapter that aims to look at Maududi Saab's take on woman, the voices of women were curiously missing, and particularly with the rising activism and high participation of women in Jamaat Islam in the last decade or so, and given the fact that Irfan Saab had also extensively carried out ethnography in campus sites, it would have been better substantiated to have female voices in this chapter. Then comes the last chapter that Irfan Saab says is a critique by ordinary subjects beyond the realm of texts. And he gives another field site of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan's Khudai Khidmatgah movement, as well as giving a lot of examples of other forms of critique, like proverbs, wherein such critiques are very much intertwined with life as well as death. As a comment here again, perhaps there was a lack of flow from the earlier focus on India to a sudden shift in field, but I get the point that the Khudai Khidmatgah was a very good illustration of such everyday critiques. But then again, Irfan Saab had to deal with texts to bring that to the fore. So one is left wondering if that is still beyond the realm of text. But having said that, one cannot deny that this is a very good illustration of such everyday critiques. Then the chapter closes with an epilogue that Irfan Saab gives his personal opinions on the topic. This is in many ways what the book puts forward, in my humble opinion. It's an extremely important intervention in today's English academia, because Islamism in South Asia is very much underexplored, and this is a very big stepping stone for future research, which I'm sure Irfan Saab will have many, but even others like us can carry forward. I'm running out of time, so I'll just give my final comment or two. Having read this book and looked at it from a distance, perhaps one thing that was missing for me in this book was a sense of irony. And forgive me for using this literary term, but just to give an example, in chapter 2, Irfan Saab had done a very close reading of Immanuel Kant and tried to destabilize the Western notion of critique from within their thoughts. But ironically or so, such destabilizings were done by precisely looking into other Western thinkers who were within that tradition. Now, if reason is always connected to a particular tradition, one can certainly argue that thinkers like Foucault or Wittgenstein or even Talal Asad are in many ways rooted in that tradition. And in that sense, admitting that and using that as an ironic trope could have made their arguments more convincing to a reader. I'm not saying that one can't utilize them, but then an acceptance of that irony could have substantiated the argument, in my opinion. Now, this then carries on to the particular reading that was afforded to Maududi Sahib. And I say this because I wish that the same critical reading that was given to Immanuel Kant could have been given to Maududi Sahib, particularly because there were other ideas of Maududi that were unexplored, which could have been a better point of dialogue with Western thought. One example being Hakimiyat, which is a very popular buzzword in Maududi's ideas. And this or other much more complex ideas of Maududi Sahib could have been a better point of dialogue. I think my time is ending up. So without further ado, I invite others to give their thoughts, and thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Wasim Saab, for such a beautiful comment. बहुत ही तफसील से आपने इस किताब का तारुफ भी कराया और उस पर आपकी जो कमेंट्स थे वो भी आपने पेश किए। इसके बाद हम सुनेंगे डॉक्टर इरफानुल्लाह फारूकी साहब को। आप साउथ एशियन यूनिवर्सिटी में डिपार्टमेंट ऑफ सोशियोलॉजी में असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर हैं और आपने एमफिल और पीएचडी जेएनयू से सोशियोलॉजी में करी है और मुस्लिम इन साउथ एशिया, उर्दू स्टडी, साउथ एशियन सोशल थॉट और सोशियोलॉजी ऑफ लिटरेचर एंड सोशियोलॉजी ऑफ एजुकेशन, ये आपके जो है वो मेन एरियाज ऑफ एक्सपर्टीज हैं। तो अब हम बहुत ही अदब के साथ दावत देते हैं जनाब इरफानुल्लाह साहब को कि वो अपने
I mean, I'm of course grateful to the organizers, to SIO for this wonderful opportunity. I'm being very honest when I say this, that I am quite skeptical about my worthiness, because I still consider myself a student. I read off and on, and I hardly write. I write occasionally, and I'm told, and I'm sure others, fellow panelists would agree with me, that writing is an indispensable exercise for anyone associated with the academia. In fact, I might as well also point out that Irfan Bhai, I've known Irfan Bhai for a while now, and off and on, as an elder brother, he keeps telling me, as a matter of well-wishing, he keeps telling me that I should write peer-reviewed journal articles and dive into the matrix at the earliest. But so far it hasn't happened. But let's hope that he succeeds and I end up doing something worthwhile. I am, as I said in the beginning, that I am I'm convinced that I'm not really in a certain sense, I'm not deserving. But then, on a lighter note, as for the undeserving bit, well, the times in which we live, we have head of states who are markedly undeserving. So I guess, in a panel discussion, this is tolerable. Just to kind of, in relation to the work, Nasir has very, very promisingly outlined the essence of the work and has also drawn our attention to the concerns that he has had as a reader. So I will not really talk about the work in detail. I'm assuming that some of our participants, some of us have already read the book, or at least are aware of the claims, its claims, and consequently its promise. So I will not really go there. But I just want to kind of just to kind of do a bit of landscaping, because I have a set of questions or comments for the author. So what I'll do is I will just kind of do a bit of landscaping, talk about one or two things that to me are very critical as far as this book is concerned. And then from there, talk about some of the concerns that I felt I had when I read the book from pretty much from start to finish. So, of course, as has already been pointed out, here is a work that is predominantly in the domain of anthropology and sociology of philosophy, anthropology and sociology of knowledge, to be more specific. Sorry, in general, and anthropology and sociology of philosophy, to be more specific. Now, there are 3-4 arguments that, for me, are they constitute the core of this work. And let me just very quickly, because we don't really, I don't have much time. So very quickly talk about these 3-4 things, and then move on to some of the concerns that I felt. So the first is, of course, enlightenment as an ethnic project. Irfan Bhai has very, very convincingly made a case for this, and has talked about how the author has talked about how the project actually basked in the glory of definitions. And we know very well that the modern age is essentially an age of definitions. And these definitions actually, and what enlightenment, a project around definitions, what it was doing was it was kind of flagging a host of, others in while it was formulating this primacy of reason. And of all the others that enlightenment threw before the public, and for a critical scrutiny, Islam, of course, had no equivalent. The otherness of Islam was absolutely fearless. And it wasn't just another religion, but as Irfan Bhai has also written, that it was the most religious of all the religions. And that's a very interesting formulation that's there in the book. And, in the times we live in, it just goes without saying that, Islam actually stands for an unsettling and violent expression of the religious. And so whatever we are seeing in the times we live in, it can easily be traced back to the Enlightenment's epistemic orientation. And so whatever we are seeing is essentially no news. This has been part and parcel of the discourse for a while now. The second thing that is very crucial, that is quite vital to the overall epistemic positioning of the work, is the way the author seeks recourse to Nietzschean genealogical method and works backwards, right, to understand the roots of our present day, what we call certainties. And we are informed about the Enlightenment philosophical discourse as a social practice. As you go through the formulation part of the book, this is precisely what paragraphs one after another try to inform us about. But then it also tells us that, as a social practice, it is not at all free of its own particularities and self-aggrandizing certainties. So, given that it is treated as a template, enlightenment as a template, a hopelessly determined and restricted framework or worldview, what we find is that Immanuel Kant and Michel Foucault, generally known and read as sort of opponents of, Foucault is responding to Kant or, critiquing Kantian position. What we realize is that, as a matter of fact, they are in an embrace. They both Foucault and Kant actually operate within a life world that is plagued by a set of certainties, and these certainties are, to go back to Dipesh Chakravarty's work, these are provincial in many ways. And then thirdly, the work actually makes a compelling case for engaging with diverse practices of critique, as as Nasir very, very eloquently drew our attention to, that there are different sites. And if we were to engage with these different sites of critique, practice of critique, then what we are essentially doing is we are broadening the scope of critique. And this is precisely what the work tries to do. And it urges us to shift our focus from the celebrated corridors, the Ivy League towers, sites of academic and critical inquiries, and find scope and meaning in the day-to-day lives of ordinary subjects, right? So there is a certain celebration of the mundane. There's a certain celebration of the ordinariness. And we know very well that in the academic world, it is conveniently neglected. The sheer force of the ordinary is something that is mostly, for the most part, is neglected in academic discourses. And lastly, the author I mean, if we go through the work, the author is not just invested in critical inquiry, but more importantly, engaging with the ethical and political objectives of this criticality, right? So the suppositions, to borrow from the author, the suppositions and the presuppositions that an enterprise of critique carries. And it is in this respect that we find ourselves engaging more with the how bit of uh, pursuit of criticism or criticism's pursuit, right? So it is not just an act, but kind of looking at the process, the ethical side of it, the political side of it, etc. So of course, it is an exciting work, and for anyone interested in genealogy and politics of knowledge, or epistemic colonization and so forth, will find this very, very exciting. It also did. I mean, it also did something to me that I wish it did not. It kind of, some of the scholars slash writers slash thinkers, I held in high esteem, and kind of loved their works to no end. Uh, but then after reading this work, I think things don't remain the same. I'm talking about people like Bertrand Russell and others. So it is. I mean, it's also unsettling in a way. Now, before I move on to some of the concerns, I must congratulate. I must put this on record as a reader student. I must congratulate the author for the for the lucidity of the prose, right? So we know very well. I mean, we have had our share of this very, very pathological state of affairs where we are asked to go through a reading and we are simply not able to make sense of the reading. I don't think this is news to anyone from social sciences, humanities. Incredibly difficult and demanding texts, almost part and parcel of our routinized day-to-day learning in universities. So academic works mostly are known for their abstractness, right? That is what distinguishes academic works from non-academic works, for the kind of labor they demand. But this work, as a matter of fact, is quite inviting, and I have no qualms in 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 saying that anyone who has a working understanding of power knowledge interface, of the ways in which epistemic hegemonies work, etc., will find it, will not really have any difficulty in sort of reading it, and more importantly, of course, understanding it. And this I most sincerely appreciate, and I commend the author for this absolutely rare feat. Now, so moving on, as I read the book, I was struck by a number of arguments, or shall we say, formulations. And I should also, clarify at the outset that much of these, is not in. So my engagement with these formulations is not necessarily informed by my limited studentship in relation to sociology, history, literature, politics, and a little bit of anthropology. That's not the case. It is actually to do with what I learned about Islam, its history, philosophy, and of course, several, if not many, prominent Muslim luminaries. And all of this happened in my family. And just to be more specific, I actually learned a great deal about all this from my late father, and Irfan Bhai knew him very well, who was a graduate of Deoband. He was a Qasmi, and also, a university academic. And I'm framing, his credentials, keeping in mind the occasion. So let me just flag some of these concerns. So there are quite a few, but because we have very little time, I'll resist the temptation of raising all the concerns, but I must flag the ones that I think are very, very critical to any discussion on a work of this kind. So I'll start with a particular formulation in relation to ulama, right? So, and the author, talks about the fact that ulama are not only to be understood, or are not simply to be understood as theologians or clerics, but they should actually be understood as scholars. Of course, there is no denying the fact that ulama are scholars. And again, I understand the premise and I appreciate the location of this formulation. But then I'm also, again, as a student of Islam, and given whatsoever little I know about Islam, particularly from the sources, I am tempted to highlight the distinction that is there between knowledge and education. So, for instance, are we suggesting that ilm and talim, the way, ilm and talim, as we use these terms in the times we live in, and ilm as it exists in or it is used in several numerous verses of the Holy Quran and various traditions of Prophet, what exactly is what is it that the word ilm invokes? And therefore alim, right? So for instance, the ways in which an alim is essentially invoked in different ahadith of Prophet Muhammad, does it really suggest a certain kind of a this worldly knowledge pursuit, or ilm suggests something that is kind of something that is distinct and something that has an edge, or something that is perhaps liberating and a source of salvation? And I'm particularly interested in this because in the Quran, when there are these numerous references where they say, where it says, for they know not, right? La ya'lamun, they know not. Now, what does this knowing imply, or what does this not knowing imply? And this is where, and for instance, a hadith very often quoted: go to, acquire knowledge, even if you have to go to China for that. Now, what kind of a knowledge is it? Is it a knowledge that is about worldly affairs, or is it a knowledge that is about a certain that's to do with purification of your heart, a certain kind of purification of your soul, and something that works very well in relation to your life after death? So that's one. The other thing is in relation to tanqeed, because this is a word that is used very often, and I think there's something very, it does, offer um, lots and lots of opportunities to kind of think about this word and its application. Uh, at one point of time, the author actually talks about, and I think it is in the beginning itself, that tanqeed is desirable and encouraged, whereas there are other terms that are used. For instance, there is takfir, there is ta'ib, fault finding, or denouncing, or tazhir, which is mocking. So it is said that tanqeed is desirable and encouraged, whereas these things are not. And I think the argument is that, again, the how bit of it and the ethical side of things needs to be kept in mind. But my concern is, again, that this is essentially from one side of the act. What about the recipient's end? So, for instance, haven't aren't there instances where tanqeed is essentially received as ta'yib, right? So, of course, it is critique or criticism, and I'll come to that. It is criticism, but then is criticism really received as an ethically well-placed act of judgment, or some kind of a morally informed analytical exposition, right? So this is something that I wanted to inquire about. That is tanqeed always received as tanqeed? Then there is this very important section on critique and criticism. Of course, in Urdu, of course, my Urdu is not really as, it's not really up to the mark. So I wouldn't really say in Urdu there isn't a word, but my hunch is, and given that Irfan Bhai has used naqd, intiqad, and tanqeed to refer to critique, I'm assuming that this is what we have. But when we think about critique as an activity, as a certain kind of a practice, and we think about criticism as a certain kind of judgmental exercise, I mean, for some reason, I find it, although at length the author has talked about this, but for some reason, I find it a little difficult to kind of treat these two as kind of synonymous or similar to each other. I mean, there is a certain relationship, of course, there is no denying that. There is, of course, a careful, I mean, in critique, we're talking about a careful judgment, a certain kind of an opinion about something. And in criticism, we're talking about, again, judgments, but more of, with a certain, shall I say, position of fault finding, right? So in literary criticism, for instance, a very, very solid analysis of a text. So, I mean, of course, there is more that could be talked about it, but since Danish is there, I think he should have the last word on this, on critique and criticism. But I just wanted to flag that. Now, there's an entire chapter which actually talks about Urdu Tanqeed, and I just want to very quickly, because there are a couple of formulations that are quite provocative, but I want to share my concerns in relation to some of these formulations, and it might take I might take a couple of minutes, so my apologies in advance. So, for instance, at length, the author has discussed, works of different literary critics, but for the most part, the author's engagement is with the late Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, one of the most celebrated critics of Urdu literature, of Urdu. So there is, for instance, the starting bit somewhere is in relation to the understanding of adab. And of course, this is in relation to Farooqi's reading of Altaf Hussain Hali's celebrated work, Muqaddama-e-Sher o Shairi. And the Farooqi's position that Hali is not a critic because Hali, towards the end of the book, is writing that he's not really presenting a work of criticism. And it is in this context the author actually pitches a very, very striking formulation that there is a way in which adab is to be understood. So adab is not just literature, but adab is also about, an author has talked about it earlier as well, rules and etiquette. I mean, and we know very well in our families, there's a way in which the word is used, adab and beadab. So a certain kind of politeness, or maybe a sense of humility, modesty, etc. And the formulation is that Farooqi kind of does not really engage with that aspect, something that Barbara Metcalfe and others engage with. Now, my submission is that, there are many other works of Farooqi. For instance, I'm particularly reminded of his very, of course, a work that has a very provocative title, How to Read Iqbal. It's 2005 article, where he has actually, he is essentially discussing something that the author has referred to in relation to Hali's work. Iqbal, in various letters of his, held that he was not a poet, right? And in so many letters of his, he has talked about this. And Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, in that particular essay, he says that, Iqbal was saying this simply because he was being humbled. So we see that there is a certain kind of application of that understanding of adab. So this is something that I wanted to, that there are, I don't think that, Farooqi is, I think Farooqi's concern with the ways in which Hali was formulating a case for Urdu, and particularly the desirability of a certain kind of literature and the non-desirability of certain kind of literature, had to do with a very, very, what should I say, a brazen allegiance to a certain kind of colonial morality. And this is something that Farooqi has not just talked about in relation to Hali, but in relation to various scholars who claim to be critic in the 20th century. So that is something that and then I think, again, as a sociology student, I think something that could be passingly also flagged is that whenever we talk about adab in terms of rules and etiquette, we also have to be mindful of the discourse on be-adabi. And this was, of course, a very, very, very powerful trope in the 19th century, late 19th century didactic literature. It was very powerful in the writings of, in the reflections in Tehzib al-Akhlaq. It was very powerful in the reflections made by Hali. It was very powerful in the novels of Nazir Ahmad, right? So the be-adabi logic is also, the be-adabi discourse, the be-adabi narrative is also something people who don't have the etiquettes? What kind of a reading do we get of these people? Just to kind of, and I'm kind of moving towards the end of. I'm sorry. I just take maybe 2 more minutes. There is also in the text, there is also a certain kind of equivalence that is drawn between Sufism and Tasawwuf. Although it is something that need not be discussed, but given the academic claim that the book makes, which is to do with a certain kind of politics of a certain kind of epistemic hegemony or a certain kind of politics knowledge, power knowledge interface. Tasawwuf is not really, I mean, if I may indulge, Sufism is something that is, at least in the contemporary usage, it is very much a Western reference. I mean, and people have written about it for the ways in which Sufism is received and the ways in which Sufism acquired a certain kind of, presence in day-to-day European life, etc. And Tasawwuf as, as a certain kind of a process or something that had to do with Islamic thought and a way, a path, a process, a journey of purifying the heart. So Tasawwuf, of course, I mean, people can translate it as mysticism or spirituality, but in my opinion, I think there is some scope in kind of maintaining a distinction between Sufism as a certain kind of a group identity or some kind of a Western reference to a non-textual Islam, a lived Islam, and through that, offering a certain critique of the textual, the ulama, the hardliners, the orthodox, and Tasawwuf as something that is perhaps way denser. And lastly, I mean, of course, there are 1 or 2 other things, but I'll just stop with this one. When we talk about religion as critique, I am wondering that can it be considered as a religious critique, right? So, for instance, when we say that people from within religion, they are essentially making statements that are not necessarily, let's say, orthodox or not necessarily limiting human agency. But then my argument, I wouldn't say my argument, but my reading is that even when people, let's say that I say that, sporting beard is not is not important, or it's not really it's not an obligation, right? But then the fact of the matter is that it will make a difference whether I sport a beard or not. So, people like, not the right example here, but let's say that people like Maulana Wahiduddin Khan making a case for all kinds of interesting possibilities within the Muslim life world. But then the fact of the matter is that, someone like Maulana Wahiduddin Khan can actually make that claim. A woman who is in hijab, when she says that hijab is not necessarily something that you have to follow, or I think there is a way in which we need to engage with the location of critique as well. That it is not necessarily something that is, again, in a certain sense, distanced from, or it is not. It need not be a disembodied or a distanced, isolated act that we can talk about. I mean, there are other things as well, but my apologies for taking 4 minutes extra. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ifamullah Farooqi Saab, for such a wonderful, engaging discussion and raising concerns and your questions, comments. Now we would like to request Danish Iqbal Saab to share his observations and comments. Danish Iqbal Saab is the Assistant Professor of English Literature Department in Aligarh Muslim University, and Literary, Cultural Studies, Minority Discourse, Fiction and Social Theory are among his thrust area. So please, Danish Iqbal Saab.
Very warm good evening to all of you. And, the predicament of being at the bottom of the list, as usual, is that most of the things that form the part have already been tabled. and probably much better than I can aspire to do. In addition to that, let me begin with a couple of caveats. But before that, I must submit my sincere thanks to the SIO, to the organizers, and to the author himself for making it to the event and allowing me to share my thoughts. Now, here is something that I would like to begin with, that I currently professionally belong to a discipline which probably appears as the master signifier of everything that the author has written against. So, in a sense, the Enlightenment project, the idea of reason, the performance of critique is very much, I would say, proclaimed by the humanities. Secondly, what I'm going to share with you is certainly not flowing from any, I would say, quote unquote, authentic knowledge of Islamic sources. So, thanks to the lucidity that has been referred to earlier, I managed to read the book. I had also read the previous book and was also present at one of the discussions of the book by the author himself in Hyderabad long ago. And I think, of course, there is a continuing thread to both the works. But I think what it primarily appeared to me in terms of its framework is, if I could frame it as such, is the performance of concepts. So instead of bracketing it under some discipline, and I think the author himself has encouraged disciplinary promiscuity, to use his own words, to make scholarship of like that possible. So what the work on the whole does is, in fact, dislodging the very guarded gates of the epistemology, the self-grounding of epistemology. Let me put it like this. So, epistemology that flourishes by carefully obliterating its own traces, its own historical traces, its own surroundings, so to speak. And as has also been mentioned earlier by the previous speakers, the work to me can be placed alongside similar works, like prominent among them being, of course, Provincializing Europe by Dipesh Chakravarti. I was also constantly reminded of, and I must admit, by another very important work, Enlightenment in Economy by Amin Mufti, who is also, in a sense, working through how a certain discourse of enlightenment, has this inherent strand which forces certain self-effacement to be performed by a certain, a certain identities, Jewish history, and then in the modern the Indian Muslims. And I think if I could add a couple of more works to this shelf, could be, to my mind, in its aim and thrust, is Susan Buckmore's work. She is also particularly in the work Thinking Past Terror, if I'm not wrong. She's also working how the Muslim subjectivity can, or fashions itself as a mode of critique. In her case, she's talking about globalization, the modern violence, etc. And I think recently she also came out with a book, Year One, which I have not read or read reviews about, but I think probably it also refers to the 1 AD as something of a breaking ground. If you could permit, I would like to, since the general overview of the book has been shared very remarkably by Wasim Saab. And Irfanullah has also brought out some of the details. So I would like to share with you a certain journey which I've noticed between a certain journey that the idea of producing knowledge has, I would say, happened. A certain journey has been undertaken, a conceptual journey, I would say, which is reflective of its own times. And then I'll go on to talk about the current book under discussion. So I'll take about 2 minutes and please bear with me. As mentioned by the author himself in the first chapter, he has fleetingly mentioned the role of the philosophers in the 17th, 18th century and the ambitious project of producing that encyclopedia, the volume, which aimed to, in a sense, contain everything, the best thought, to someone, Matthew Arnold's phrase, that the best that could be thought, and to compile it in such a way that if some tragedy were to strike the world, that compendium in itself will be enough to erect what has been written about. Now, that was your 18th, 17th, 18th century. Coming back to 2000s and 2018, a book by a Polish author, novelist, who also won the Nobel Prize a year later, Olga Tokarczuk. She wrote this novel, an experimental novel called Flights. And this novel, interestingly, has been written in the form of fragments and reflections. And it's all about traveling. How human beings are in fact human beings because they're in motion. I mean, if some of you are interested, you can look up. But there's a fragment where she's talking about Wikipedia. So what I want to kind of collate here is the Enlightenment project of encyclopedia and the Wikipedia. And I think that will be my point of entry into the current work. And so very quickly, she says, I quote, "As far as I can tell, Wikipedia, this is mankind's most honest cognitive project. It is frank about the fact that all the information we have about the world comes straight out of our own heads, like Athena out of Zeus. People bring to Wikipedia everything they know. If the project succeeds, then this encyclopedia, undergoing perpetual renewal, will be the greatest wonder of the world. It has everything we know in it, everything. Definition, event, and problem our brains have worked on. We shall cite sources, provide links, and so we will start to stitch together our version of the world, be able to bundle up the globe in our story. It will hold everything. Let's get to work. Let everyone write even just a sentence on it, whatever it is they know best." Now, with a hint of irony, she proceeds. "Sometimes I start to doubt that it will work. After all, what it has in it can only be what we can put into words, what we have words for. And in that sense, it won't be able to hold everything at all." And then she proposes something which is really interesting. We should have some other collection of knowledge. Then, to balance that out, it's inverse, it's inner line, everything we don't know, all the things that can't be captured in any index, can't be handled by any search engine, for the vastness of these contents cannot be traversed from word to word. You have to step in between the words into the unfathomable abysses between ideas. With every step will slip and fall. It would appear the only option is to get in even deeper. Matter and antimatter, information and anti-information. So this is her a quick snippet that she has put down under the heading Wikipedia. Now, what I'm trying to get at is that there is certain turn, if one could locate, in how we think about epistemological questions. In social sciences, people have come to term it ethical turn, and which is being widely cited by the author himself, that is with the works of McIntyre, Assad, etc. And here, as you can see in its literary manifest, the idea of doubt, irony, and the search for or to come to an understanding that the profusion and proliferation of information may not necessarily translate into knowledge. Now, what we have in this work is something of a similar kind, to my mind, because what it tries to do, in addition to ground the Enlightenment project as a localized, ethnic, more importantly, temporal, and it opens up the questions of how certain concepts, come to conceal their temporality. Right. So, what we find here from a discussion in the first section under formulation is the not only the notion of enlightenment and critique as being ethnic, but also that how it guards itself, right? So I think a more interesting way of looking at it is not merely to is not, I won't say it is sufficient to merely say that for these reasons, or let's say in his or her work XYZ does not mention Muslim or posits his or her thoughts against Muslims. But a rather more fruitful exercise will be to glean from the arguments made in the first part would be to locate that how do these this entire matrix of cultural, the historical, the philosophical, it comes to kind of form, congeals into a certain philosophy, and transcends itself and becomes self-evident. In the discussion early on, although the reference to the Indian condition, and particularly while talking about Maududi or the questions of Muslims in India, although it appears in the second half, I think the section on Amar the Same is also instructive in a different sense, and that is a problem of history writing, as observed earlier. And I think I must kind of bring to light that Partha Chatterjee, in one of his articles, he in fact says that how this tripartite understanding of the ancient, medieval, and modern, it has also resulted in a certain singularity of national history. And as a result of which, and I quote, classical heritage of Islam remains external to Indian history. And it only makes appearance in the form of, in the cultural sphere, or the as domesticated element of everyday life. These are his words. Moving on to the next section on critique and criticism. I must confess that the juxtaposition of Kant and Foucault, and I don't want to go into the details of Kant's essay, and that has been very elaborately discussed in that chapter. But I think the distinction between the Kantian understanding of enlightenment, not only as a moment, but a certain focus on present, is, I would say, lopsided. Because Foucault in his essay has very clearly kind of marked different attributes to this description as if you remember, the negative description of exit from darkness, and how he enjoins upon people that this is the modern, the conceptual stress of modernity is, I mean, in relation to Kant, he's saying that it impels upon one to produce, to fashion themselves, and this discussion on Baudelaire, brings it up. So my kind of concern was that merely for the reason that Kant and Foucault, they are referring to the same history, doesn't necessarily, to my mind, and I'll be happy if the author could, clarify this a little bit, could belong together in terms of, because what the chapter says in this book is there's an implication, as against substantiation in the case of Kant. So, and later Foucault, as we know, is widely read and cited in terms of, one could say, the as stringent critique of the democracy, the principles of democracy, etc. While reading the book, the very title of the book reminded me of another important essay that was Ramanujan's "Is There an Indian Way of Thinking?" So Ramanujan, as most of us who would have read it, you can see that he places stress on different words, and then he says that how it reveals different anxieties, right? And this is evident here as well, because I think, and once again, I'll be happy to be corrected here, but I get a sense that this stringent critique of Enlightenment principles down the ages, which is brilliantly done. But I think at the same time, it inversely, I would say, makes religion transhistorical, and flowing from the same history. And I think that, probably it runs the risk. I mean, if one reads the chapter, I particularly felt like that unless we come down to the to the discrete sections in the second part, the illustration where you have the actors, where you have speakers, where you have interlocutors, where you have scholars, there are articles, etc. The first part of the discussion makes one feel that it is kind of not quite illustrating the Assadian paradigm to me. Because when Assad is talking about religion, he's very wary of course, defining religion. And he says it can mean many different things. It is an act of circumscription, he says, of different things, time, space, ideas, etc., which come together under this category. So when we follow the same strain of criticism of critique, then I think transhistorically, it kind of, in a sense, makes religion appear a little more, I would say, essentialized. I don't want to use the word, but it kind of makes me, that was my reading, just to put it like that. Secondly, I think a lot, I may have overshot the time given to me. So I'll make two quick submissions, but I hope that they will generate some discussion. One is, one of the most brilliant insights to me particularly was the center staging of, well, not center staging, but certainly bringing in death as a phenomenon that informs the notion of critique. Now, this is something that is barely even mentioned, because critique is a state of being. Critique is something in action which you bring yourself to. And death inspiring critique is a wonderful, I would say, juxtaposition or putting together of two diametrically, opposing phenomenon in the Western tradition. So I think one of the best offerings that this reading makes available is to demonstrate that how the notion of death is central to the prime activity of life as understood in the Western history. I wish that it had gained a little more attention. I think it does remain a little unexplored. It is interspersed here and there. And I think uh, that could have done justice to the ambition, which is to critique the Western notion of critique. So, I mean, it's a comprehensive project. I don't think a 15 or 20 minutes remark by anyone will be able to, do justice to the immensity and to the consequential nature of this project that Professor Irfan has, been at it for 2 decades now. Secondly, I would once again, and this is something which is to do with my own disciplinary persuasion, that is the notion of culture. Now, what I'm saying is, in a sense, pushing the text to say a little more than what it is doing. I think there is a certain collapse of religion and culture happening in this text. And even as I read those remarks by the interlocutors, and even the citations from Maududi's own writings, culture is read as something which is secondary, to how you fashion yourself. Although its importance is asserted time and again in Maududi's own writings, that you can't ignore culture. There is a deep relation between culture and the power that be. But once again, it remains unexplored. And why am I saying that? Because this takes me back to the section on Urdu Tanqeed, which Irfan has talked about. And I don't think this is very well established, that how the notion of culture from the Victorian period in the writings of people like Arnold, and as kind of moved from the this culture-religion equation to a more practice and power relation-oriented understanding of culture. And I think when one of the interlocutors, if I'm not wrong, named Adil, when he asked the the author, "Okay, आप तो Western educated लगते हैं, so why don't you read the Maududi's writings by replacing religion with culture?" So what he's also trying to do is, in fact, looking for a way to to find a channel of dissemination here. Let me put it like this: that how culture is seen as a desacralized space, culture as a secular space, or a secular understanding of culture. So culture as a meaning-making domain which is available to everyone. And I think I'll end here, and by connecting this concern to a very important point that the author makes with regards to Maududi's project of Hukumat-e-Ilahi, and that which is tied with the notion of sovereignty. Now, if as a student of a political theory or history, if you look at the career of Maududi's ideas in Pakistan and the rupture that happened there, which the author has also very wonderfully demonstrated, that what was happening on the other side of the border. Popular sovereignty also presumes, which is not spelled, but it presumes a certain popular desire, right? A certain popular desire for God's will, right? And I'll once again refer to one of the articles by Faisal Devji, where he says that it ends up unwilling the individual will. right? And that is why it fails as a political problem. He is saying that how Maudud's theology has failed, so he calls it as a political Islam as a misnomer, because it fails to address the antagonisms of politics. So what I'm trying to say here is I would say, a more fruitful engagement, in the sense that it speaks back to some of the political conceptual categories. I think will be, and I'm sure that a lot of people who read it and who take interest in the Muslim politics, Islamic politics in South Asia and elsewhere, would center stage the notion of culture. And to just go back to the notion of death, I think, and if I'm not wrong, this there is a certain absence, at least in the at least among the works that are available in English. I don't know about the works that have been published in, let's say, Urdu or Arabic. A certain, I would say, mode of writing that is Kierkegaardian in nature, in response to modernity, right? And this notion of death, regulating your critique, can probably open up that space. Thank you.
Sharing your thoughts, your observations, and highlighting and appreciating the main points and points of contributions in the discussion of the field, and also probably pointing to some or opening some more horizons to engage with the discussions which the other has dealt. Now it's time to listen to Prof. Irfan Ahmad, author of the book. And Prof is very well known for us, so we don't need an introduction of him. And he's professor of anthropology in Max Planck Institute of Social and Religious Thought in Germany. So welcome, Prof. Irfan Ahmad, and please.
Okay, so thank you to the organizers, the panelists, the screen was not visible. Is everything okay?
Yeah, it's very okay.
Okay. So thank you to the organizer, to Zulkarnain, and to the three panelists for taking time to read the book and making their observations. So I'm grateful to them. Now, many points have been raised. Clearly, I cannot respond to all of them, in part because I think many of these comments, they were not substantially developed. They are more like sort of, responses which have been there as a result of reading, but not sufficiently and adequately thought through to be formulated as a question per se. So I will not address them. So let me respond in the sequence in which these reflections were made. Okay. So I will start with Wasim, and I think, yeah, so you sort of did present a largely accurate picture of what the book is aiming to achieve, except that, and I'm sure this was probably because of lack of time or some kind of lapse. So the point is not that, the idea of Islam began with Maududi. Islam as a concept is a Quranic concept, and for me Maududi is important because he is part of a tradition which precedes him, so it is not that something that is exclusively associated with him. Now, some of the points that you raised, I mean, of course, I think let me say, make a larger point, which is to say that, of course, this is a book about critique, and if you remember, the last sentence of the book is that, over to you, dear readers, to judge religion as critique, So it follows that, readers are the readers are free and to make comments and to reflect. But I want to say something which is of a general nature before moving to the specifics, which is to say that in order to make a point or critique, we have to also be aware of the etiquettes of critique, namely that I think it is not sufficient to say that, okay, A, B, C has not been looked into. In any case, no book can address everything, So if you, for example, somebody says that you have not done A, B, C, then if you do that, for example, then someone else can say that, well, you have not addressed the X, Y, Z, So that kind of criticism, and actually it is not properly speaking criticism per se. So those points are not from the perspective of critique and discussion as well. These are not adequate. So, for example, when Wasim says that, I have not attended to the fact that there were many ulama who were also attracted to Maududi, or, for example, there is less attention to his work on Tafhim al-Quran. Now, accepting that if this is the case, or this is in your reading, then the question is, you have to explain to me, why attending to them is important in relation to the goal of the book. Okay, and that was not clear to me. The second point that you raise, and that I think is in part born out of certain kind of misunderstanding. So when you ask me, like, I don't discuss, so these list of don'ts, or it applies not just to me but to any author, that, okay, you don't do this, you don't do this. So that again is it has to be located in relation to the theoretical and methodological goal of the book. Okay, so to say, and I want to be specific here, so when you say that, well, there is no discussion to the fact that what this critique leads to, does it lead to action, and I think there is a gross misunderstanding here, because this implies that critique in itself is not an action. So if you mean that action comprises something which is like a physical action, or I don't know what you have in mind, so you can clarify that. So does it lead to mobilization? Does it lead to building of an institution, and so on and so forth? So I think the assumption that, and that probably is what one can infer, is that, well, critique is probably a mental or intellectual exercise, which in itself is not an action. An action is something else. So that, I think, is not in my view, it is not a right assumption. The fact that women's voice is missing, yes, that is true. And it is not because I didn't want to. So the places where I was doing field work, I made repeated attempts, to have access to the women members and sympathizers. And this was not allowed, partly because of, and one is clearly to say that, the book doesn't deal with South India is obvious, where I think things work differently. But in the context of my field work, that was not, so one has to also see that who are these women member. In most cases, they were always connected to the male members in terms of relation and so on and so forth. So one important person told me that, well, if you want to do an interview with my wife or daughter, I can allow you for 1 hour, that's it. So that is not what I wanted. I wanted something which is, and right in his presence, So I thought that would not, that is not the kind of interaction that I'm envisaging. So anyway, I guess my point is clear, that it is not because I didn't want to, and also there were very few members. Now, so another point which Wasim raises is, I found it quite curious. So some of the readers in the West, so to speak, and this is probably the final point that you made, and if I understood you correctly, and if I didn't, so you can come back and make an intervention. So probably you meant is that the way I critique Maududi and Jamaat, the same style or the same approach is probably missing in the case of the critique of the Western Enlightenment. There are exactly the opposite reading by some readers. But here again, I would have been in a better position to respond to this had you also clarified what is the implication of this, again, in relation to the argument and goal of the book, But nonetheless, I found it a curious response. Okay. Now, let me move to Irfan's point. So, I will not individually thank each of the three panelists because I have already done it. So let me move straight away to the key points that you have raised. Yeah, one of the things which the book foregrounds is, so when, for example, you said that, Islam is not just one among many religions, but most religious of all religions, that is true. But you have to relate this to the larger point of the book, namely the staging of the contrast and the constant needs to depict the West or the Enlightenment or modernity as the conceptual counterpart to the self-understanding of the West. So of course, in one formulation, this is the contemporary one. It is the most religious religion of all, and yet there is simultaneously, or this depiction coexists with the fact that actually Islam is not a religion. So if you read or if you watch Geert Wilders, the Dutch Islamophobe, he says that Islam is not religion, it is an ideology, and he equates it with fascism and Mein Kampf and so on and so forth. Now, in the contemporary context, this contrast is staged by saying that, look, when it comes to sexuality, Islam is an oppressive religion because it doesn't allow sexuality. In 19th century, Victorian understanding of Islam, it was exactly the opposite. Islam became sort of, coterminous with sexual debauchery and so on and so forth. So the point is not simply Islam being most religious of all religions, but to see, and I'm talking about if one wants to use the term of brothel, namely longue durée, that over this longue durée, how this need for contrast with the passage of time and with the change in social and cultural and political circumstances, the depiction can also change. What doesn't change is the need for re-staging the contrast, whereas the actors of the contrast or the content of the contrast can change. So it is within this larger framework that most religious religion description of Islam Islam is placed. Now, the other points that you raised, I mean, the term ulema, so should it be used more narrowly as it is used now, or because my case is that to render ulema as clerics or theologians, this is misleading. Now, why I'm saying this? The reason is the following. So if you read, and I'm not talking about just Maududi or anyone, so one point is the self-understanding of the actors the book deals with. So you will find in many places that when Maududi or others, they describe Aflatun and all these Unani falsafi as ulama Europe or ulama Yunan, right? So in their own understanding, if Aflatun is an alim, okay, so in their usage, it is not limited to the contemporary meaning of which is the synonymy between so-called cleric and theologian. By the way, this term itself could not be problematic, but the sheer negative vehemence with which the word religion or clerical itself has been invested. So when somebody says cleric, they don't mean actually that, this is a nice guy. It means like, the idea of being closed, rigid, and so on and so forth. That is one point. The second point, and is clearly, I think, I mean, you see, all these modern disciplines, whether it is sociology, history, political science, and so forth, they are all children, some are legitimate, some are not, of late 19th century European development. So what you had before is philosophy. Okay, so likewise, and I'm just explaining why I am saying this, so I don't think Ibn Rushd or other people, you could say that they were cleric in the sense in which it is used today, because these are the people who are writing about falsafa. They are writing about they are writing interpretation of Quran. They're also writing medical text. They could be also writing about the science of the sky and so on and so forth. Now, in that sense, an alim was a broader term. Okay, now it is reduced to one particular function or identification. In other words, what I'm indirectly saying is also that how knowledge itself has been compartmentalized with the increasing modernization of our life, and life as essentially itself has been fragmented into so many domains, and of which these terms are also symbolic of that thing. So indirectly, I am making an aspirational plea, so to speak, for people who work in the field of knowledge to also expand themselves. Now, this is not necessarily essential to the point, but I think nonetheless it needs to be made, that especially in relation to India, that Hindu religious figures in the public domain, they are described as seers, as spiritual leaders, as gurus. Okay, and you can find empirical examples of that. But somebody who is interviewed from Deoband or Nadwa or Braley, and by the way, it is not the so-called mainstream journalists. Many Muslims themselves write that, a cleric from Deoband, right? So if you see the valuation or the signification which is attached to the respective words like gurus, seers, and spiritual leaders on the one hand, and cleric, mullah, and Molvi on the other, you can see the vast difference, and also the diametrically opposed meanings attached to that. Now, the other points that you raise, I think, if critique is taken as tazheek or tanqis, now I don't see that depends upon the on the intellectual caliber or the intention of the receiver. If she is and also the whole issue of comprehensibility, to what extent he or she has understood. But if the intention and the goal and also the modes in which the critique is met, and one can see from the text. So ideally speaking, so I cannot give you a definite response to that, but ideally speaking, it should not be taken as tazheek. if it is being taken as tazheek or tanqis, despite the fact that in the modes of critique or in the text of the critique there is no indication of that, then to say the least, this is unfortunate. But it also, I would say that, it is a reflection on our own lives, and that I want to relate to the idea of Islam, that our own nafs. So to what extent and to what degree we have that spiritual kind of enhancement, where one can also see the valid points made by others. If we don't see that, that means there is something wrong with our own spiritual spiritual upbringing in some ways. Now, the final point I want to address is about Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. So you don't seem comfortable with the way that I deal with Shamsur Rahman Farooqi. Now, if I understood you, your main point is the following: that I say that Farooqi has a very narrow idea of what adab is, and I bring the comprehensive idea of adab. Now, the example of Farooqi's skewed vision of adab that I give is through Altaf Hussain Hali in Muqaddama. Now, you say that, well, elsewhere, Farooqi has also said something which is closer to what I'm saying, right? Now, if that is the case, then you could have also said, if Shamsur Rahman Farooqi had that idea, why did he say in the place where I'm citing him, why did he say, or why did he put forward a narrow vision of adab? Now you don't do that, okay? So that is your choice. You are free to do that. The other thing I wanted to say is you didn't say much about the literary nationalism which Shamsur Rahman Farooqi symbolized, and that is something that we have to think about it. And it is not just Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, but people like Gobind Chand Narang and a host of others. So the nationalization of literary corpuses, their literary ideas, and so on and so forth. But here, and that is where I will conclude, I want to make a methodological point here. So I think the ways in which you approach this and the way I would look at it, there will be some kind of difference, which is the following. So if you deal with an author, and the kind of project that this book is, okay? So when it was being sent for review, I recall, the editor asking me that could I suggest some people who also know anthropology, who also know philosophy, who also know literature, and that too Urdu literature, and who also knows a little bit of Farsi, Now, what I want to say here is that this is an intervention in which the author is located in particular disciplinary tradition, but that is not where the entire intervention is located. Now, in this kind of task, so to give you another example, I got it read by the late Abul Kalam Qasmi. Now, he's a Urdu literary critic, and then he would say that, well, there are A, B, C that you have not quoted in the book. Now, the point is, of course, even if I had quoted that 6 or 7 people, then there would be question of another 10 people, you know. Now, one has to say, by not citing these people, or let me put it this way, has the non-citation of certain figures led to a weakening of the argument, or in what ways the non-citation changed the argument? He didn't say that. So anyway, my point is, when you deal with this kind of things, so one approach to knowledge is called corpus-based knowledge. Okay. Now, of course, you can say that even if the book that you apparently refer to, even if I had cited, then I mean, Shamsur Rahman Farooqi has written, probably over 30 books. Now there could be, and there are people who do, for example, individual based knowledge. So those who do deal with biography. So, for example, there is, Durkheimian studies, there is Nietzschean studies, So something like, if there is Shamsur Rahman Farooqi studies, and these are the people who will devote their entire life or career going into each and every work that Shamsur Rahman Farooqi has done. That is not the approach that I have adopted. So to iterate, I would say that the reference that you gave, and if he had a wider idea of other, then the question would be the sources that I cite, why did he say there if he had that wider idea of other? Now, let me shift to Danish. So, I think I'm not sure, if all the points that you made, I understood them clearly, but I found it very fascinating, your reference to the exercise of encyclopedia making during the Enlightenment, especially in the French connection, and the contemporary sorry, just a second. And the contemporary Wikipedia thing. But that connection that you drew on, it was not entirely clear to me, partly because, and this is my speculative comment, the novelist that you mentioned, I don't know that novelist, but in itself the point looked very penetrating and worthy of being thought through more carefully. Now I want to make a clarification here, which I have done so elsewhere. So I think it would be it will be actually going against the proposition and the goal of the book to say that in some way it is situated or related to Dipesh Chakravarti and Amir Mufti and Susan Bookmores. I mean, these are like, in any case, when you mentioned that you didn't give me reasons how you look at it, how actually it is situated in that sense. I would say that actually, and that was the reason I had to bring Amartya Sen in the introduction, because prior to the book, when I was dealing with these ideas and when I would talk about critique in Islam, so the national, territorial, or geographical way of working in academia is that they will say that, okay, so you do deal with India, which I said yes. And then they would say that, well, Amartya Sen has already done it, and he shows that there is a thriving way of doing critique or criticism, and so on and so forth. So I want to say very strongly that my project and Dipesh's project are substantially different. Now, I cannot go into the details of this, but those of you who would be interested, you can read a response that I wrote. So this journal called Critical, what is that? Critical Religious Review or something like that. So it had a symposium on my book, and 4 or 5 people made their comments, and I gave a response. And one section of that response especially deals with the difference between my project and that of Dipesh. So likewise, I think it doesn't serve much purpose to say that for example, I mean, Parthajarji wrote about externalization of Islam in the case of Bengal. I think he did, but you cannot just say this unless you also ask that how in the nationalist thought and the derivative discourse there is hardly any place for Islam and Muslim political thought. So but I can understand, I think the kind of context from where it is coming. There are what might be called there's like certain saintly figures, and in order to conduct an intellectual discourse, one has to make reference to those saintly figures. So that is one way of doing a scholarship, but that is not necessarily that everyone should do. So yeah, I mean, likewise, I thought much like Irfan's on another point, when he made that difference, like religion as critique or religious critique, and this idea of sporting a beard and so on and so forth. So I mean, if I can remind that the book clearly says that, for example, there has been criticism of Jamaat or Jamaat related people by the communist, but I don't deal with it. So in the same way, to say that my take on Foucault and Kant is lopsided, Well, yeah, of course you can say that, but the reason you give itself is lopsided. So if you see why I'm saying this, so Foucault too says that critique. I don't have the book in front of me, so my words cannot be exact, but there is a citation from him saying that critique is unique to Europe and it was born as a result of the Reformation. Okay, now it is on this specific point that how critique as a practice and critique as an idea, so both for Foucault and Kant in different ways, not exactly in the same ways, but in different ways, both situated within the precinct of European intellectual tradition. So that is the reason I'm saying. Now I have explained to this. If you find this lopsided, then you have to tell me, and you should actually do clarify then why it is lopsided. So the reasons are not sufficiently clear. So likewise, Amir Mufti and my project is entirely different. He wants to see enlightenment in the colony, and I'm more interested in enlightenment in the metropole itself, going to the extent that asking or suggesting to readers that given its all racialization and otherization of Islam, is it worth to continue to call it enlightenment in that sense, rather than assuming something enlightenment and then talking about it in the colony? And of course, his dualism between religious and secular, or he claiming himself to be someone who is carrying forward the legacy of Edward Said, who is represented in many ways as a key figure or carrier of what is called secular humanism, So, and likewise, I think, this is one of the easiest way of criticizing someone. I can also tell you that the way you summarize the book, you essentialized it. So this essentialization argument, unless it is backed or shown specifically, what actually it means. Now, and this is where I want to conclude with for the moment before you can come back and we can have exchange. I think essentialization, not specifically in relation to what you guys have said, essentialization in itself, in my view, is not necessarily bad, provided one clarifies why it is being done. So, for example, if I say that, look, I think the main distinction in a society should be made between the oppressor and the oppressed. And you can come and you can say that, well, you are essentializing the whole thing because, and this is essentialization, because I'm putting forward in front of you two categories, oppressor and the oppressed. Now, if you say that I'm essentializing it, and then you will have to say that actually, look, all the oppressors are not the same, and then those who are oppressed, within the oppressed, there are oppressor, and within the oppressor, there are oppressed. And you can, multiply or pluralize these two categories to deactivate my argument about essentialization. So these are some of the thoughts. But finally, and let me say this, because this list of not doing this. So when I was teaching in Australia, I received, and this was a conversation over a cup of tea or coffee. So one reader, he had read my book, Islamism and Democracy, and he made a very intriguing comment. And the meeting was actually, he wanted to have coffee because he had read the book and he wanted to share his thought. So he said many things, but his opening remark was that, well, I read the entire book and nowhere you have defined what is democracy. And that is true. So my point is that any intellectual inquiry cannot do this. That also you cannot, you have to take many things as comprehensible. So there is also a relationship between the author and the reader. Now, and I think, and this is probably some kind of prospective remark which I want to make, is, and it is also slightly different in the sense that, so what I want to say here is the following, that there are many ways in which an author interacts or deals with the readers. Now, there are authors for whom there are ready-made readers, and there are authors for whom readers have to be born, or readers have to be made or cultivated. So these are just like two of the many ways in which this interaction between author and reader works, and depending upon the trajectory of the author and the readers as well, at what stage of life one is. And I think, in my view, the task of the author is not simply to address a reader, but also to fashion a reader, to create a reader. And it is precisely in that moment of something to happen or something about to happen in the future, that hope, that is also a source of a strength, or what keeps the author on toes, as well as keep himself or herself engaged and dynamic. So I think I should stop here. And again, I want to thank you, all the panelists, for their time to have read the book and for have offered their reflection. I hope my responses were more in the style of creative engagement.
Thank you so much, dear Professor Irfan Ahmad. It was really a great time and wonderful discussion. We were discussing the book, namely Religion as Critique, and we had in fact very critical engagements from our learned panel and so the response from the prominent author. It was a great opportunity indeed to listen to the informed observations and enlightening response. I'm sure we all enjoyed the discussion, though the time was not sufficient to cover every dimension of the book. It would definitely have been more fruitful had we have time for interaction, but unfortunately, we don't have more time. We hope we would keep organizing and engaging with such highly intellectual and academic discussions. Let me thank you, all the participants, ladies and gentlemen, my dear brothers and sisters, and thanks for great panel and great professor, Wasim Nasir, Danish Iqbal, Irfanullah Faruqi, and Irfan Ahmad. The session is ending here. Take care. Good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Zulkarnain, and thank you, Irfan, Wasim, and